Welcome to episode 8. Today we will be covering David Glenn Lewis, and this is District Dark. On the night of February 1, 1993, drivers on State Route 24 near Moxee, Washington saw a man walking in the road. He stood out right away. It was dark, it was cold, and he did not look like someone who belonged there. Witnesses later said he seemed confused or unsteady. One driver turned around to warn other cars, but when they came back, the man was lying in the road. He had been hit and killed. The vehicle that struck him did not stop. Witnesses reported seeing a Chevy Camaro leaving the area. The man carried no ID, so police had no name for him, and he was buried as a John Doe. At that point, nothing about the scene tied him to Texas. Nothing at the roadside scene told police that this dead man had a wife and child more than 1,500 miles away in Amarillo. Nothing told them he was a lawyer, a former judge, and a college teacher. Nothing told them the people back in Texas were already trying to figure out why he had suddenly disappeared from home. For 11 years, those two cases stayed apart. In Washington, there was an unidentified man killed in a hit and run. In Texas, there was a missing husband and a father named David Glenn Lewis. It took more than a decade for investigators to learn they were the same person. And even after they made that match, the largest questions did not go away. Why did David Glenn Lewis leave Amarillo? How did he travel so far in so little time? And what was he doing on the highway outside Moxee, Washington, less than 2 days after he was last seen at home? This is the case of David Glenn Lewis. For years, David Glenn Lewis was a missing man from Texas. Then, in 2004, investigators learned that he had actually died in Washington state in 1993, only a short time after he vanished. That gave his family one answer. They finally knew where he had ended up, but it did not explain why he went there, how he got there, or what had happened in the time between his disappearance and death. The reason this case still holds people's attention is not only the distance involved, it is the way the details refuse to fit together in a clean way. There are the signs left behind in the house, the car parked near the courthouse, the airline tickets bought in his name, the money that showed up in his bank account, the clothing on his body in Washington that his family said they did not recognize. Each detail adds something. None of them closed the case. So tonight, we're going to walk through it slowly. Who was David? What happened in the last days before he disappeared? What his wife found when she came home? How an unidentified body in Washington was finally linked back to Amarillo? And what still is not known after all these years. David Glenn Lewis was born on December 11, 1953 in Borger, Texas. He graduated from Texas Tech University in 1975 with a degree in political science and later earned his law degree there in 1979. He married Karen in 1982 and the couple had a daughter. By the early 90s, David had built a solid professional life in the Texas Panhandle. He had served as a judge of the Moore County Court of Law after being elected in 1986. Later, after the unsuccessful run for district judge, he returned to private law practice. He also taught government classes at Amarillo College. Those details matter because they show the shape of his life before his disappearance. This was not a man living on the edge of town with no routine and no ties. He had work, he had a family, a public role in the community. He had students, legal clients. He was known. That does not mean his life was simple, but it does mean his disappearance did not happen in a vacuum. When he vanished, people noticed. Public reporting on the case also says that during his time on the bench, Karen Lewis later remembered that he had received threats. There were also legal matters around him that later drew attention from investigators and from his family. Those details would become important after he went missing. because they raised a possibility that his legal work, not his personal life, might have mattered to the case. The public timeline becomes much clearer in the final days of January 1993. On January 28, David left work early, saying he did not feel well. That same afternoon, he bought gas. Even so, he still went on to teach his evening class at Amarillo College, and he taught until around 10 p.m. That is one of the last confirmed points in the case where he had been placed in Amarillo with confidence. The next day, January 29, a member of his church reported seeing him hurrying through Amarillo Airport without luggage. That sighting has stayed in this case because it suggests he may have been traveling or preparing to travel almost immediately after last routine points in his schedule. But even that sighting does not explain much of its own. It tells investigators that he may have been at the airport. It does not tell them where he was going, why he was in a hurry, or whether he was alone. Around the same time, Karen and the couple's daughter were in Dallas on a shopping trip. That meant David was alone at the house for at least part of the weekend. It also meant there would be no one at home to see exactly when he left, how he left, or whether anyone else came to the house. That gap in direct observation matters. In many cases, the last ordinary moments become important later. Who saw that person? What were they wearing? Did they take a bag? Did they say they would be back? In David's case, some of those ordinary questions have no clear answer because the house was empty when the key change in the timeline happened. Karen and her daughter returned home on January 31. What they found has been one of the most talked about parts of the case ever since. The VCR was still recording the Super Bowl, not just part of it. It had started from the beginning and kept recording beyond the end of the game. In the refrigerator, there were 2 turkey sandwiches. Laundry had been left in the washing machine. On the counter were David's wedding ring and watch. He was gone. Each of those details sound small. Together they are what made the disappearance feel wrong from the start. A person can choose to leave home. That happens, but when someone leaves behind a partly lived-in evening like this, it raises questions. The recording suggests he had expected to be home during the game, or at least wanted to save it. The sandwich suggests he was preparing food for himself, or possibly for someone else. The laundry, normal household routine, not a clean break. The watch and ring left behind suggests either a fast departure, a planned choice to remove them, or some other event that changed what he was doing. None of this proves exactly what happened. What it does show is that the scene inside the house did not look like the end of a carefully planned escape. It looked unfinished, it looked interrupted, and that is why the house became such an important part of the story. It does not solve the mystery, but it shaped the way the mystery was understood from the beginning. The next major part of the timeline involved David's red Ford Explorer. Around January 30 or 31, a vehicle matching his Explorer was seen near Potter County Courthouse in Amarillo. A police officer reported seeing it there, and later deputies saw it there again. At one point, a man matching David's description was reportedly seen across the street taking photographs of the courthouse. Then, on February 2nd, the Explorer was found near the courthouse. Important personal items were still inside. His keys were under the floor mat, his checkbook, credit cards, and driver's license were in the vehicle. That discovery narrowed some possibilities and opened some others. If David had planned to vanish and start over, leaving behind his ID, credit cards, and personal papers made that plan harder to understand. If someone else had moved the vehicle, then why leave it near the courthouse? And if David himself had parked it there, what was he doing downtown, and why was he reportedly photographing the building? The courthouse location has always stood out because of its ties to his disappearance, at least on the Texas side, to a place connected with his legal life. That does not automatically mean the courthouse is the answer, but it is part of why the case never stayed in the category of a simple missing persons report. The house looked wrong. The car was found in a meaningful place. and David himself had worked in law and public office. Those facts kept investigators and family members looking at more than one possible direction. Karen Lewis reported David missing after he failed to show up for appointments and after the signs at the home no longer looked like a short absence. In the early stage of the case, investigators had worked with what they had: a missing adult man, a house left mid-routine, a vehicle downtown, no direct evidence of violence in the home, no confirmed statement from David explaining where he had gone. Cases like that can be difficult at the start, because police have to sort through several possibilities at once: voluntary departure, medical problem, accident, breakdown, or foul play. What made David's case different was the pileup of odd details that arrived almost immediately. The airport sighting, the courthouse sightings, the state of the home, the vehicle parked away from the house. These were not random facts drifting in from different months. They all appeared right around the same narrow window when David was disappearing from his regular life. But even then, there was still no clean path from clue to explanation. A clue tells you where to look next. It does not always tell you what it means, and in this case, almost every clue seemed to point in more than one direction at once. As the investigation continued, people around David looked at whether something from his legal work might explain the disappearance. Public reporting says Karen Lewis remembered threats from years when he served as a judge. There were also civil and criminal cases around his professional life that later drew attention. Reporting summarized on the case page says he had represented a man in a case tied to a convicted murderer, and that some legal files connected to one matter could not later be found. Those details matter because they gave the family a reason to consider foul play. At the same time, they are not the same thing as proof. Threats do not always lead to violence. Missing files do not automatically show a crime. Legal work often puts people in contact with conflict, anger, and unstable situations. In David's case, those factors became part of the background the family could not ignore. But they did not produce a named suspect or a direct line from a threat to his disappearance. So this part of the story stayed where it is now, important but unresolved. There were reasons to ask whether his work mattered. There was not enough public evidence to say exactly how it mattered or whether it did at all. Then the case became even stranger. Investigators later found unusual financial and travel activity linked to David's name. A deposit of $5,000 was made into his account. Airline tickets were purchased in his name, including one from Dallas to Amarillo and another from Los Angeles to Dallas. Public reporting says investigators could not determine who made the deposit, who bought the tickets, or whether David actually used them. This part of the case is important because it changed the scale of the mystery. Before the financial records and tickets came into focus, the case was mostly centered in Amarillo, the house, the courthouse, the airport, and the missing vehicle. But once tickets tied to Dallas and LA entered the timeline, investigators had to consider the possibility that David had traveled far from home in a very short amount of time, or that someone else had created a false trail in his name. The airline activity did not settle the question of whether he left on purpose. Instead, it kept both major paths open. One path said he may have been moving around under his own power. The other said his name may have been used without records explaining who was actually traveling. Public sources do not resolve that conflict. They only show that the ticket purchases exist and that police could not fully explain them. And in a case like this, that matters. A ticket in someone's name sounds solid. It sounds like a hard fact, but investigators could not show who bought it and who boarded the plane. The fact stays limited. It becomes another marker in a timeline, not a conclusion. Another detail that stayed in this case came from a Dallas taxi driver. According to public reporting summarized on the case page, a driver later remembered taking a nervous man resembling David from a hotel in Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport on February 1. The man reportedly paid cash and had a wad of $100 bills. This account has always stood out because of the timing and behavior. If the sighting was correct, then David was still moving through Texas or passing through it very close to the time of his death in Washington. If the cash detail was accurate, it also tied in with the unexplained money around the case. But, like the airport sighting in Amarillo, the Texas story has limits. It is a later recalled witness account, not a signed travel record. It can help shape the timeline, but it does not close the gap between Texas and Washington. So again, the case gains one more detail without gaining a complete answer. That is the pattern all through the David Glenn Lewis case. The record is not empty. In fact, it is full of facts. The problem is that the facts do not line up into one plain sequence that explains what happened from beginning to end. Now we return to Washington. On the night of February 1, 1993, at about 10:30 p.m., motorists near Moxee saw a man walking on or near the highway. Soon afterward, he was found dead. He had been hit by a vehicle. Reportedly, a Chevy Camaro was seen leaving the area. That driver was never identified. The dead man also had no identification on him, and so the case became a John Doe case in Yakima County. The man's clothing added another layer of uncertainty. When he died, he was wearing military-style camouflage clothing and work boots. Public reporting says his family later did not recognize those clothes as his. The man was also not wearing his glasses, even though David usually wore them. That detail would later matter, because glasses were the one thing that finally helped identify him. The long separation was one of the most important parts of the case. For 11 years, Texas had a missing person file, and Washington had an unidentified dead file. Both were real, both were active in their own way, but they did not meet. That gap says something about the time, the systems, and the limits of what could be connected quickly in the early 1990s. This was before the kind of constant digital linking that people expect now. Two distinct jurisdictions could each hold one half of the truth without seeing the full picture. A family could search for a missing husband while, at the same time, another state had already buried him as a John Doe. That is exactly what happened here. It also means David's family lived for years without even the smallest real answer about where he had gone. They also did not know he was dead. They did not know he had reached Washington. They did not know the missing person mystery had already become a death case. That kind of long uncertainty changes a case in a different way than a quick answer would. It stretches grief across years and leaves the central question hanging in place. In 2003, Washington State Patrol Detective Pat Ditter revisited the Moxee John Doe case. According to public summaries, Ditter started comparing the unidentified man to missing person records he found online. During that work, he came across David Glenn Lewis. The resemblance was strong enough to get his attention. One detail had held him back at first. The dead man in Washington was not wearing glasses, while photographs of Lewis often showed him in them. But later, eyeglasses found among the evidence helped bridge the gap. This was the break the case had needed. Not because it answered the whole mystery, but because it finally connected two halves of the story. The unidentified man in Washington might not be a local at all. He might be a missing lawyer from Texas. Once investigators had that possibility, they could move from resemblance to testing. DNA did the rest. Public reporting says testing showed a 99.1% likelihood of a family match using a sample from David's mother. In 2004, Washington John Doe was officially identified as David Glenn Lewis. The identification solved one major problem. David Glenn Lewis was no longer missing in the sense of location. His family now knew that he had died in Washington on February 1, 1993. The John Doe had a name again. The identified dead man and the missing Texas lawyer were finally understood as one person. But the identification did not solve the larger case. In some stories, identifying the body leads straight to the answer. Here, it did not. In some ways, it made the case more difficult because it forced all the earlier questions into a tighter time frame. If David died in Washington on February 1, then the distance from Amarillo to Moxee had to be crossed very quickly. There was no direct flights between the two cities, and the drive is more than 1,600 miles and would take a full day non-stop. Yet, David had been tied to events in Texas only shortly before his death. So after 2004, the case had a name and a death location. What it still did not have was a plain route, a clear purpose, or a full explanation. To understand what still does not fit, it helps to lay the last known events next to one another. On January 28, David is confirmed in Amarillo, leaving work early and teaching a class that night. On January 29, he is reportedly seen hurrying through the Amarillo airport. On January 30 and 31, his Explorer is seen near the courthouse, and a man matching his description is reportedly seen photographing the building. On January 31, Karen returns home and finds the house in that half-finished state. On February 1, a taxi driver later reports taking a nervous man resembling David to Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. That same night, around 10:30 p.m. Pacific Time, David dies in Washington as an unidentified man on a highway near Moxee. The case depends on whether all of those details point to David directly, and if they do, how they fit together in one continuous line. If he moved under his own power, then he covered a huge distance while leaving behind personal items and no clear explanation. If he did not move under his own power, then someone else had to move him, manage or create travel activity in his name, and leave behind a very strange scene in Texas. Public sources do not settle that question. That is why this remains an unresolved death and disappearance case even after identification. Knowing who the victim was solved the name, it did not solve the path. The clothing David wore in Washington has stayed important for a reason. His family said the camouflage-style clothes and work boots were not clothes they recognized as his. Public summaries also note that he was not wearing his glasses when he died, even though he usually wore them. Those details do not automatically mean someone dressed him. They do, however, matter because the clothing is one of the few direct things attached to the body. The house in Amarillo, the car in the courthouse, and the airline tickets can be read in different ways, but the clothes on his body were physically there at the end. And if his family was right that the clothes were not his, then that becomes one of the most concrete signs that something in the final stage of the timeline was outside his normal routine. The missing glasses matter in a similar way. They were part of how people recognize him in life. They were part of why investigators later connected the Doe case to David, and yet, at death, he was not wearing them. So even one of the identifying details has two sides in this story. The glasses helped solve the case, but their absence at the scene added one more question. One part of the case is more direct than the rest. David died from injuries caused by being struck by a vehicle on the Washington highway. Public sources describe the death as a result of a traffic collision, and the driver who hit him was never identified. But even the fact leaves room for questions. The collision explains how he died. It does not explain why he was there. It does not explain whether he had been wandering, dropped off, fleeing something, confused, or trying to get help. It does not explain whether the hit itself was a plain traffic event or whether someone knew he was in the road. Public sources say those questions remain unresolved. So the death certificate layer of the case is only one layer. Cause of death is not the same thing as an explanation of the full event. In David's case, the line between those two things is a whole mystery. After all these years, several core questions remain open. How did David travel from Amarillo to Washington in such a short period of time? Public reporting says there was no direct flights between the two cities, and the drive would have taken close to 24 hours non-stop. Why were the airline tickets bought in his name, and who bought them? Investigators could not determine who purchased them or whether he used them. Who made the $5,000 deposit into his bank account? Public summaries say that was never explained. Why was his Explorer left near the courthouse, and why was he reportedly seen photographing that building? Public sources include the sightings, but no public explanation closes that part of the timeline. Why did the house look as though he had stepped out of an ordinary evening and never returned? The sandwiches, laundry, watch, ring, and the running VCR all remain part of the case, but none of them have been tied to a confirmed final sequence. And finally, why was he on the road outside Moxee, Washington, in clothing his family did not recognize, without his usual glasses, with no ID on him, only hours after the last movements connected to him in Texas? Public sources do not answer that question. Today, David Glenn Lewis is no longer a missing person in the strict sense. He was ID'd in 2004 and later reburied closer to home, but the larger case remains unresolved. The basic outline is known. David's disappearance from Amarillo at the end of January of '93, his house and vehicle were found under strange conditions. Travel and banking activity in his name raised more questions. On February 1, he died in a hit and run near Moxee, Washington. 11 years later, DNA finally gave the unknown dead man his name back. What was missing is in the middle. The missing middle is the whole reason the case continues to be discussed. There is no public final answer showing whether David left by choice, under pressure, in fear, confusion, or someone else's control. There is no public explanation for the route, the money, the ticket purchases, or the courthouse activity that ties the whole thing together. David Glenn Lewis was 39 years old when he disappeared. He was a husband, a father, a lawyer, a former judge, and a teacher. In the last days before he vanished, he moved through a life that looked active and ordinary from the outside. He worked, taught class. He was reportedly seen at the airport. His house still had signs of normal life. Then he was gone. A little more than a day later, he was dead on the road in Washington state, far from home, with no identification on him. It took 11 years for investigators to connect the man in Washington to the missing lawyer in Texas. That solved the name and did not solve the story. And that is where the case still stands. Not as an empty mystery because there are many facts, but as a case where the facts stop just short of one of the things everyone still wants to know. What happened between Amarillo and Moxee?